So who is really winning Hispanics? That's, I mean, if you read the media narrative, it's not a question. It's obvious that Clinton is winning Hispanics, right? If you look at the situation a little bit more carefully, there actually is more of an open question here. There's an article here by Nate Silver, and I think that he's very badly analyzing the information in front of him, and his conclusions are a consequence of a bad analysis. I'm just going to pull out a quote here. Its exit polls also show some evidence of Clinton's strong performance with Hispanics, although with some inconsistencies. They have her winning Hispanics by more than 40 percentage points in Florida and Texas, and by nearly 30 points in New York, although narrowly losing them in Nevada and Illinois. He then takes that information and projects it, or uses it to project that Clinton will win Hispanics in California because she won Hispanics by large numbers in Florida and in New York. But he's pointing out that there's some inconsistency. She lost them narrowly in Nevada and Illinois. But he's saying, like the larger scheme of things, it looks like she's winning there. Now, if you look at that information, what you need to do before you start, plotting things and determining if there's just statistically valid relationships, before you even get there, you need to ask if there's another explanation that might be better at explaining what you're seeing here. I mean, I'm not really arguing with what he's saying. It's true. It's just it's not a very smart analysis. Maybe accidentally on purpose. Before you jump, to your regression analysis, you need to look at whether it makes sense to do a regression analysis, or whether you may have. See, the regression analysis only makes sense if you're comparing like data. So you need to be sure that you're actually comparing like data, right? You have to be comparing apples with apples. And I think that it's pretty obvious that if you look at the information in front of you, you're not comparing with apples, rather you're comparing apples with oranges, okay? Florida and New York are apples, and Nevada and Illinois are oranges. And we can see that there's a really good explanation as to why it is that she won Hispanics by such large margins in those states and lost them in these other states. And the reason is that Florida and New York are closed primaries, meaning that it's very hard to register to vote in those states. You need ID, which implies a certain income level. Whereas Sanders won Latinos in Nevada and Illinois, which were both open states. Illinois was an open primary, and Nevada was an open caucus, which means that more Latinos were allowed to take part in the process. They didn't need as strenuous documents to take part. Okay. So then you can ask, well, which is more reflective of the broad will of Latinos? Is it the closed primary that restricts access to, the upper class, or at least the middle class that has documents, can take part, can register, right? Or is it the open primaries that allow, independents, are not as strenuous about documents, they don't check up on you, all these sorts of things, right? I don't think there's an argument there. I think it's obvious that the open process is more representative, right? I mean, it would be very by definition, open or closed. This isn't metric spaces, right? So open and closed are. It's a math joke, anyways. But this is exactly the kind of boneheaded thinking that has pushed Silver into such a corner with his models this year. Like, it's just a good example of the kind of errors that he keeps making, and he keeps getting lucky. It's not going to happen in California. Okay, he's going to see his model collapse in California. Texas is Texas. It is, and if you discard it because it's Texas, there's really strict. It might be an open primary, but that doesn't mean that everyone's allowed to vote as Texas, right? So note that Florida and New York were closed primaries, and therefore skew very heavily towards upper class voters, whereas Nevada and Illinois were open primaries and are therefore both a broader representation of Latin speakers and a better predictor in California, which is, they say it's semi-open, so what that means is that Republicans can't vote in the Democratic primary. If you're an independent or unregistered, then you can vote. Okay? Instead of arguing that Clinton performs well with Latin speakers, Silver should be looking at that data and pointing out that closed primaries make it very hard for Latin speakers to vote. What he's picking out is consequently not minority strength from Clinton, but the efficacy of voter suppression laws in preventing poor minorities from taking part in elections, right? So that's what you really see when you look at the data in Florida or New York, and you see that she won Hispanics by this huge margin, but then you look at it in Nevada and Illinois, and you say, geez, it's, not that different than, the way the whites voted. The conclusion is not that, well, she should win Hispanics by, as though that even makes any sense, right? As though people vote specifically because of their skin color or their heritage or their language, right? Again, you can understand why they'd vote against Trump. That's something that's been in the news. Is it really that out to lunch to suggest that, the way that Trump is approaching the issue is really ridiculous, right? The guy has been saying a lot of really racist things about Mexicans. Is it that crazy for, a Mexican judge to react? But he shouldn't. Trump's reaction should not be that, I'm outraged that the Mexican is reacting to all of my racist statements. It should be, if you say racist things about people, it's gonna come back and bite you, right? You spend a year attacking Mexicans, and then the Mexican judge reacts against you poorly. Surprise, it's, and the way the media is approaching it is though, justice is blind, this is absurd, right? We've had multiple periods of critical legal analysis. If you know anything about law, you know that justice is not blind, okay? That biases are everything in law. So is that crazy for Trump to say, this is ignoring the merits of the case, right? I think that anybody that looks at the case is going to conclude that the judge made the right choice, right? But regardless of that, if you put that aside, right, is it that crazy for Trump to say, this is a Mexican judge and he's ruling against me because I'm openly racist? That's not so crazy. That's the way the legal system works, right? That's a critical analysis. You hear that all the time with white judges, right? When you have black people that go in and you have a systemic system, you have a system that's designed that way. Racist white judges ruling ruling unfairly against black people. That's called critical race theory, right? Which is an instantiation of the critical legal theory. So then you get, the situation flipped over, and all of a sudden now we're talking about how justice is blind, after forgetting everything that we think we know about how the legal system actually works. It's not a crazy idea. But one should not react to saying that the judge is unjustified in ruling against your racist ass It's that if you're going to go out and say racist things on a public platform, there's consequences, Mr. Trump. And you deserve to have that gavel smacked over your forehead for being an asshole. Okay? Because that's the way the system actually works, is that you have all of these biases. Maybe you shouldn't run your mouth off. Right? Anyways, that's what I'm getting at with this as well, right? There's a system in place, and it's designed to suppress minorities. And surprise, it worked. It worked in New York. It worked in Florida. The system doesn't exist in Nevada and Illinois. So it didn't do what it's supposed to do because it's not there. And the conclusion that you really ought to be drawing, and it will be very obvious in California, in a few days once California votes, is that if New York was an open primary, it would look more like Illinois. The results. And that's what we're going to see in a few days. Okay? Now, after thinking about that for a little bit, I decided to make a post to clarify what I'm saying. Because, I think that, my narration, filled in some holes there, but the initial statement might not have been as clear. So let's be clear about what I think is happening. We can do this in a 5-point rundown here. Point 1. A state elects a Republican governor, like in Texas or Florida or Arizona. That state passes restrictive voter suppression laws that makes it hard for poor people, who in the United States happen to mostly be minorities, to vote. So it's a class thing, but poverty is racialized in large swaths of the United States, and that is true, so it's easy to get confused. The state then runs a closed primary, which requires registration. Registration is hard in states with voter suppression laws, so lots of minorities can't register. And then it follows that only the minorities that can register, which are the wealthy ones with proper ID, are able to vote. Then exit polls indicate that Clinton won minorities by large margins, and the media concludes that she has a large lead with these minorities, when in fact, it's actually the consequence of laws that make it hard for minorities to vote. And so the system is doing what it's supposed to do. It prevents minorities from voting. Or at least it prevents poor minorities from voting. If you buy into the system, you're a wealthy minority, then that's fine. You can be the diversity at the table, right? And it explains why Sanders wins Latin speakers in open primary states where minorities can vote and loses them in closed primary states where they can't vote. And that's why they have closed primary states, because they don't want minorities to vote in those states, unless they're wealthy. And it goes a long way to explaining the ridiculous age discrepancy with black voters. But it's not she is winning black voters through some combination of enthusiasm and disenfranchisement or apathy amongst young black voters. But it's the closed open difference is at least gonna get the numbers a little closer. But with Latin speakers, I think that it probably is the biggest thing there. So if you're going to try to bring models up about how Latin speakers are voting, you want to do something that's predictive, you can't, it doesn't make sense to take data from a closed primary and try to apply it to an open primary when we have plenty of information that suggests that Latin speakers vote very differently in a closed primary than they do in an open primary by design. It's not a conspiracy theory, it's American history. It's what the United States is. And you can be willfully blind to it if you'd like, but it would behoove you to actually, kind of clue in. You do live in a country that is designed to have a really brutal class structure, and within that is a lot of racialized poverty. That's the reality of things. So you can't do what you're trying to do. It doesn't make sense, and we'll see that in California. when, I mean, it might be a fairly clean split. She might win by a few points at the end of the day. Um, I mean, if you look at the data in Nevada, Illinois, it doesn't suggest that he's going to run away with it or anything, right? You know, he won those. He won very narrowly, right? So, I mean, I think that probably the better way to look at it is to suggest that it will be reflective of the overall vote, right? So if you look at Illinois was pretty much split, right? It was a split, and if you look at the Latino vote, it was a split. Nevada was a split, the Latino vote's a split. It looks like California is probably going to be close to a split. Although I do think that there's some reason still to think that Sanders could get a good boost there. But it's probably going to be pretty close to a split. And if it is pretty close to a split, then the Latino vote will probably also be pretty close to a split because it will reflect the, you know. And that's really, I think, what you need to pull out of this, is that in an open primary, there's really not any... The fact that some people speak Latin as a first language doesn't have any effect on their vote. Okay? And that's really what I've been trying to say for the whole time, is that it doesn't, there's no causal suggestion, right? And if you pull out a correlation, then it's some kind of a proxy variable, because there's no logic there. You know, I speak Spanish, therefore I prefer, like, it doesn't, there's no reason to build that. And so it's a classic situation of, you know, correlation does not imply causality. And you can get lucky for a real long time with confusing a correlation if it's masking a proxy variable, right? So in New York, what it's masking is class. You're going to really see that breakdown in California, okay? And what you're going to see is that whatever the numbers are out, you know, if Sanders wins, if Sanders gets 55% in California, you're going to see the Latino vote is going to be something close to that, right? You know, 5 or 6 points one way or the other. And this bias that the media has been trying to construct almost out of default, right, is going to be exposed as not existing, right? And that's what I want people to walk away from this election with, is with the understanding that there is no Latino vote, and that if you look at the data properly, you know, and you take out, you know, all of these, you know, suppression tactics that they use for the closed primaries and everything else, okay, what you're going to see is that Latinos vote the same way that the general population does. And that's what everybody should have thought in the first place, you know, if you didn't live in such a, you know, a systemically racist society that wants you to categorize people by their skin colors and their languages and these other sorts of things, right? I explained this a while back as well. I mean, you can give the statisticians a little bit of a pass because, in a sense, they're doing their job, right? They're looking for some kind of category. If this is the data you give them, then that's the analysis they'll come up with, right? If you give a statistician a bunch of charts and it's broken down by language and race and gender, then that's what they have to play with, right? If you give them a chart and it's broken down by, you know, ideas, by ideology, by how people, you know, think on specific issues, then they'll be able to build data based on that. But if you don't give them that, then they can't do that. But at the same time, you know, smart statisticians should be able to say, I can't do anything with this data because it's not predictive. There is no cause and effect relationship between skin color and ideological, you know. I can use it as a proxy in certain areas, but you have to give me space to explain. And if you're going to ask me to present data based on identity politics, I'm not going to do that, because it's dishonest. And I don't care what your political scientists think. They don't understand what they're saying. The fact that statisticians are not doing that is reflective of the society. And the questions in the first place are reflective of the society. So, I mean, you can give them a little bit of a gray area, but they really should have been pushing back on this from the start. And the fact that they're not is just reflective of the system, right? The questions are reflective of the system, the responses are reflective of the system, and the analysis is reflective of the system. And, you know, I've got some pushback. I've been talking to people at the bars, you know, about the system, and they're all just kind of like, hey, you're Canadian, you know? Let Americans figure... Well, okay. And you'll notice that I'm ranting on my own space. In the Canadian election, I went to the Huffington Post, I went to the CBC, and I went to the Globe and Mail, and I commented there. And I got into large arguments, and I drew a lot of attention to myself. I'm not doing that here. I'm staying in kind of, you know, distant spaces, and I'm letting people come to me for my analysis. And I understand what you're saying, but at the other end of things, an outside perspective is very useful, right? Somebody that's not lost in the cultural biases and able to actually see things from a distance is very clear-headed. And you might not like what I say. In some ways, you might not even understand what I say because you're lost, right? You're lost. You know, it's the ant can't see in 3 dimensions, right? Doesn't mean the 3rd dimension isn't there. And your system is 2-dimensional. That's actually a very apt analogy. But having somebody look at it from the outside is you should take it for what it is, right? I'll acknowledge that there are certain things I don't understand about the United States. I've stated that on numerous occasions. You know, like I don't understand this. I don't, you know, but and I'll understand if there are things that if you read what I'm saying and you say I don't understand what you're saying because you know you're lost in whatever cultural bias, ask questions, react, respond. Because seeing it from that outside perspective can only help you understand it, right? And even when I'm not able to understand something, I am smart enough that I can explain that, right? I'm not going to get lost on something. If I don't understand something, I will see it from that perspective, right? Anyways, I'm rambling, but when I say that the whole thing, like, it reinforces itself, and maybe it's necessary for somebody from the outside to say, hey, wait a second, guys. You know, you're trying to suggest that language is a predictive variable in an election? That's insane.